we have, beginning at verse 19, have you not heard of Al-lat and Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? These were three pagan goddesses. These were the daughters of Allah. So Muhammad delivers these verses, but instead of what you have in the Quran today, what Surah 53 originally said was this: have you not heard of Al-lat and Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. So now, you don't just pray to Allah, you can pray to Al-lat, Uzza, and Manat, who will then go to Allah to intercede for you. This is what Surah 53 originally said, and I hope that every time a Muslim, from now on, you open the Quran to Surah 53, you'll recognize that this passage originally promoted polytheism. Polytheism. Your Quran originally promoted polytheism. So, according to your sources, Muhammad delivered these verses to his followers. His followers bowed down in honor of the revelation. Muhammad himself bowed down in honor of the revelation. And the pagans were so overjoyed that Muhammad was finally acknowledging their pagan deities, they bowed down too. So what do we have here? Well, Muhammad delivers revelations that promote polytheism, and he delivers a revelation that doesn't come from God, because just a little later, a little after Muhammad delivered these verses, he came back and said, you know those verses that I gave you as part of the Quran? Sorry, the devil got me. The devil tricked me. And so, according to Muhammad himself, the devil tricked him into promoting polytheism and delivering a revelation that didn't come from God. Now, what were the two criteria that Moses gave that we have confirmed from the Quran, from Muhammad himself? The Torah. Moses gave two criteria. If you deliver a revelation that doesn't come from God, or if you promote polytheism, you're a false prophet, you have to die. Muhammad did both. Now, Muslims obviously don't want to accept this, even though your scholars throughout the first century of Islam agreed that Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses. Muslims today want to reject this, and as time proceeds, the further we go through Islamic history, the more Muslims reject this. And it's not because of the evidence. The evidence is as solid as a rock. We don't have much better evidence for anything in Muhammad's life than we do for the Satanic verses. But Muslims eventually came to believe in a doctrine called Ismat al-Anbiya, God's protection of the prophets. Now, originally in the first century, this doctrine meant that God would not allow a prophet to persist in error. He would not allow a prophet to continue in error. So a prophet might go astray, fall for a trick of Satan, deliver false revelations, but God's going to come along later and show him where he went astray. Later Muslims, in later centuries, came to believe that God's protection of the prophets applied to them all the time. God's never going to let a true prophet go astray. And so Muslims had to reject the story of the Satanic verses, not based on history, not based on the facts of history, but based on their theology. So the Muslims say, yes, all of our sources say Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses, but all those sources have to be wrong because God would never allow a prophet to be deceived. Now, that reasoning is horrible. What you should say, if you really believe that God would not allow his prophet to go astray, is, well, Muhammad's not a true prophet because he delivered the Satanic verses, and therefore he went astray, therefore he can't be a true prophet. But that's not what Muslims said. They simply rejected all of history. But we're not going to share that horrible reasoning. We're not going to say, well, Muhammad could never go astray. We're going to say, we have our two criteria from Moses himself. We have our two criteria of a false prophet. The question for us is, how do we know that Muhammad actually delivered these verses? How do we know that some of Muhammad's enemies didn't invent this story? Well, here we have the historical method. You can't just say, hey, I don't like that about history, therefore it's not true. No, we have to approach this objectively, examining the evidence. And how do historians investigate a story like this? Well, historians have various criteria, tools that they use to examine whether a story happened. For instance, one of the criteria a historian is going to use is early sources. The earlier, the better. So the question is, do we have early sources for the Satanic verses, or are these things that came long after Muhammad, centuries after the start of Islam, much later than our other sources? And what we find is that this story appears in our earliest Muslim sources. Ibn Ishaq is our earliest extant biography on Muhammad. Ibn Ishaq wrote about the Satanic verses. Yeah. The early Sirah scholars across the board told us about the Satanic verses. So when we look at Ibn Ishaq and Waqidi, our earliest historical biographical sources on the life of Muhammad, across the board they point out the Satanic verses. So we have, that's one criteria, that's one criterion that is met. We have early sources for the Satanic verses. The next thing a scholar is going to look for, a historian is going to look for, is multiple sources. And this makes sense. If you just have one source saying something, well, maybe someone made it up. But if you have a lot of sources all telling you the same thing, well, it's harder to believe that someone just made it up when so many different sources are saying the same thing. This makes sense, doesn't it? Doesn't it make sense to say you look for the earliest source because that's less likely to be embellished or to be influenced by people's theology? The earlier, the better. And doesn't it make sense to say that the more sources you have reporting something, the more probable it is to be accurate and reliable? And so how many sources are we dealing with when we talk about the Satanic Verses? Are we just dealing with one or two, maybe Ibn Ishaq and Waqidi? Is that what we're dealing with? Any guesses? 5? Anyone want to say 10? 15 maybe? 20? Do I hear 25? Do I hear 30? 35 maybe? We actually have 37 sources that I know of. 37 sources that I know of reporting that Muhammad delivered the Satanic Verses. Now this should really bother you because these are all Muslim sources, my friends.
Produce your proof.
These are all my sources.
I can hear out there TV
we're going to go into the reports. But think about this.
Right here.
I have 37 Muslim sources reporting that Muhammad delivered the Satanic Verses. Now, actually, there are variations. In fact, the later you go with the sources, the more they try to change it to say, no, it was actually Satan who disguised his voice as Muhammad's voice and said it when Muhammad didn't know what was going on. Muhammad didn't realize that Satan had spoken with his voice, and he tricked everyone and so on. So that's what the later said. But the earlier you go, you find these were words that Satan tricked Muhammad into speaking because Muhammad could not tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. So what do we have so far? One, we have early sources. It's in your earliest Muslim sources that Muhammad delivered the Satanic Verses. 2, we have not just 1 or 2 sources, we have a ton of Muslim sources reporting the Satanic Verses. Now, an additional criterion of a historian is, are these sources independent? Are the sources independent? In other words, if I say something and then everyone just repeats what I say, well, yeah, that's kind of multiple sources, but really it's just one source because everyone's just repeating me. Similarly, if there's one ancient document that says something and then a bunch of other people copy it, that's not multiple sources. That's only one source that had been copied by a bunch of different people and passed on by a bunch of different people. So what we're asking is, when we trace back the stories, do we find that it all started with just one person, one horrible, mean liar, or were many people, many different people who had access to the truth, all saying the same thing in the first century? Now, let me give you, when we do that, and here the Muslim method of isnad, of actually giving a chain of transmission, for once comes in handy, because we can trace these names back and see who it was that were delivering these reports. So of the 37 sources that we have, here's what we have. Of the 37 sources we have for this story, 6 go back to Ka'b al-Qurazi, one of Islam's greatest early Quranic scholars. 5 of these sources can be traced back to Urwa ibn al-Zubair, who was an early Meccan scholar who's known as the founder of the study of the life of Muhammad. If you're not sure, I find that Muslims have no clue who any of these people are because they don't study their early history. But if you'd like to know who he was Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter Asma, who was one of the first 20 converts to Islam. So this is who's reporting this. 2 of these stories go back to Abu Bakr ibn al-Raham ibn al-Harith, one of the top scholars of Islamic law during the first century. 5 go back to Abu al-Aliyah al-Basri, another of the greatest Quranic scholars of the first century. He studied the Quran with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. If you don't know who those names are, please investigate it. Ibn Abbas is the founder of Quranic studies. Zayd ibn Thabit is the one who came up with with the Quran that you have today. Caliph Umar, you know him. Ubay ibn Ka'b is one of Muhammad's top experts on the Quran. These are the people that this man studied with, and he reported that Muhammad delivered the Satanic Verses. 2 of the sources go back to Al-Sudi, another early scholar who studied with Ibn Abbas. 1 comes from the tafsir of Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi, an early commentator who composed the longest tafsir that had been written up until his time. 4 reports go back to Qatada ibn Diyama, one of Islam's greatest early commentators. 1 goes back to Al-lat.